The first ending came on a Tuesday in October, just past 3 in the morning in a rented room above the cobbler's shop on Mill Street. Maren Holbrook sat on the edge of the iron bed and listened to her husband's breathing thin out like smoke disappearing into a cold sky. For 9 months she had listened to that sound, the slow gathering, the shallow draw, the wet rattle that had crept in around midsummer and refused to leave. She had learned the music of his lungs the way a sailor learns the sea. Every shift, every silence, every sudden drop. And tonight the music was changing for the last time. She knew it before he did. A wife knows. The lamp on the side table burned low. The wick needed trimming. She did not trim it. She held his hand instead, that big working hand that had once split fence rails for the Coleridge farm and laid the foundation stones of the schoolhouse in Pine Hollow. The hand was cold now. The fingers that had braided her hair on lazy Sunday mornings were thin as kindling. She pressed her thumb against the inside of his wrist and felt the pulse there fainter, like a moth beating against a closed window. Outside, the autumn wind moved through the maples along Mill Street, and the leaves made a sound like distant applause, as if the world itself were saying goodbye to a quiet man it had never properly noticed. Elias opened his eyes once. The lamplight caught them, and for a single long moment he was looking at her the way he had looked at her on the day they were married 11 years ago, in the white clapboard church on the hill. There was no fear in his eyes. There was no regret. There was something else. Something Maren did not understand then. A sorrow that had nothing to do with his own dying. A sorrow that was about her, about what she did not know, about something he had carried alone for too long. His lips parted. He whispered 3 words. The pine, the pine, the pine. Then his breath stopped. She did not weep. Not yet. She sat with him in the lamplight and held his cooling hand and watched the wick burn down to a black curl. And somewhere in the silence between 1 minute and the next, she understood that the world she had lived in had ended. The house she had kept, the bread she had baked, the plans they had whispered about in bed under the patchwork quilt his mother had stitched. All of it gone. All of it folded up like a letter and sealed with wax and dropped into the dark. She was 29 years old, and she was alone. The grinding ending came afterward, slower, crueler. The kind of ending that does not finish you in one stroke, but takes you piece by piece the way a farmer plucks a chicken. The undertaker came at dawn, a thin man named Pelham with a black coat and a kind face, and he took Elias away in a wagon. The cobbler's wife brought up a pot of beef tea and stood in the doorway and said all the right words and meant most of them. By noon, the rumor had reached the courthouse. By the next morning, the creditors were knocking. Maren had not known about the debts. She had not known there were debts at all. Elias had been a careful man, a quiet man, the sort of man who counted his change twice and kept his accounts in a ledger with a leather spine. But when she finally opened that ledger in the cold gray light of a Wednesday afternoon, she saw what she had been kept from seeing. The numbers were neat. The handwriting was his. And every page was a small disaster. Dr. Whitfield, $84.60. The pharmacy in Brattleboro, $22. A specialist in Boston, $60 for a single visit. Patent medicines, tonics, a bottle of laudanum that had cost more than a month's rent, coal during the bad winter, a loan from the bank in Bellows Falls, $150 secured against everything they owned. He had been sick longer than he had told her. The ledger said so. The numbers said so. The first entry for Dr. Whitfield was dated June of 1906, more than 2 years before he died. She closed the ledger. She set it on the kitchen table. She placed her palms flat against the wood and waited for the table to stop moving, because the table was moving, the whole room was moving, the floor was tilting under her like the deck of a ship. He had known. He had known for 2 years, and he had said nothing. The sale began on a Friday. The constable was apologetic. He was a young man with a red mustache, and he had played ball with Elias when they were both boys, and he could not look Marin in the eye. He read the list aloud in the cold parlor, while 2 men in canvas aprons carried things out the front door. The clock that had belonged to her grandmother, the walnut bureau Elias had bought her for their 5th anniversary, the wedding china, the good wool rug, the brass bedstead, the kitchen stove, even the patchwork quilt. Because everything had to go, everything had to be sold. The law was the law, and the debts were the debts. She stood in the empty parlor when they were done. The afternoon light came through the window and lay in long, pale rectangles on the floor where the rug had been. The walls had marks on them from the pictures that had hung there. The house was a body that had been emptied of its organs. The constable cleared his throat. He held out a small leather folder. "There is one thing left," he said. He did not look at her. "The land out by the northern ridge, 10 acres. There is no buyer for it. The creditors did not take it. It is yours." He pressed the folder into her hands. Inside was a deed. A single sheet of yellowing paper with a notary's seal and a faded blue ribbon. 10 acres of rock and scrub pine on the far edge of the territory, where the wind came down from the northern peaks with a blade in its teeth. 10 acres. And the great fallen pine. Everyone in Pine Hollow knew about the pine. It had been the talk of the county for 10 years, ever since the lightning had taken it down on a summer night in 1898. A white pine of monstrous size, the kind that does not grow anymore in this part of the world. The kind that had been ancient when George Washington was a boy. The bolt had split it down the spine and laid it across the most promising patch of soil on the whole parcel. And the great root ball had been ripped clean out of the earth, leaving a crater the size of a parlor. The locals called it the Dead King. They told their children not to play near it because the wood was unstable and the crater was deep, and old roots had a way of holding on to things that fell into them. The land was worthless. Everyone knew that. The pine had ruined it. The crater had ruined it. The thin soil and the rocks and the bitter wind had ruined it. And now it was hers. The last gift of a husband who had bought it for reasons she did not understand and could not ask him about, because he was lying in the cold ground behind the white clapper church on the hill, and the dead do not answer questions. She walked out of the empty house with the deed in her hand and the clothes on her back and 17 cents in her pocket. The cobbler's wife, who was a kinder woman than the world had given her credit for, had packed a small carpet bag with a change of dress and a heel of bread and a tin of lard. Marin took the bag. She did not cry. She had not cried yet. The crying was waiting in her, gathered behind her eyes like water behind a dam, but the dam was holding for now. The dam would hold until she was alone. The road out of Pine Hollow climbed for 6 miles through the maple woods and over Coleridge Pass and down into the long valley where the Holbrook land lay. She walked it. She had no horse. She had no money for the stage. She walked it in her good black morning dress and her thin city boots. And the wind came up sometime past noon, and the sky turned the color of old pewter, and the air began to smell of pine rot and the first small hint of snow. She passed 3 farmhouses along the way. At each one a curtain twitched. At each one a face appeared briefly at a window. Word had moved faster than her feet. The widow was walking out. The widow was going to the bad land. The widow Holbrook, with nothing but a deed and a carpet bag, headed up the ridge to die. No one came out. No one offered her a ride. They watched her pass, the way a man watches a fire he has decided not to fight. She reached the property as the sun was setting. The sky in the west was a long bruise, purple and yellow, and the clouds rolled slow and heavy. She stood at the edge of the road and looked across her inheritance, and for the first time since Elias had stopped breathing, she felt something other than the gray weight of grief. She felt the pine. It was not what she had expected. She had pictured a fallen log, a big one certainly, a trunk on its side. But the thing that lay across her 10 acres was not a log. It was the corpse of a god. The trunk was wider than she was tall. It stretched for more than 100 feet across the slope, and the root ball at its head was a tangled cliff of earth and broken roots that rose nearly 15 feet into the air. The bark was furrowed like the face of an old man. A long, dark scar ran the length of the trunk where the lightning had struck, and even in the dying light she could see the wood inside. The scar was black, charred, transformed by fire into something that was no longer wood and not yet stone. It was magnificent. It was terrible. It was the most enormous dead thing she had ever stood beside. The crater yawned at the head of the tree, a deep semicircular pit where the roots had torn themselves out of the ground. The walls of the crater were raw and dark and gleamed faintly with the moisture of the deep earth. The bottom was carpeted with old leaves and a few broken stones. Marin set down her carpet bag. She stood at the lip of the crater and looked into it. The wind moved past her ears with a high, thin keening, and somewhere far off a crow called out 3 times, and the long shadow of the dead pine lay across the ground like a black bar. The dam in her chest finally broke. She sat down in the crater. She put her face in her hands, and she wept. She wept for Elias, for the bread she would never bake him again, for the children they had wanted and never had, for the 11 years that had passed too quickly, for the 2 years he had carried his sickness alone, for the debts she had not known about, for the house that was no longer hers, for the empty parlor with the pale rectangles on the floor, for the 17 cents in her pocket, for the cold that was coming down out of the northern peaks, for the loneliness that was the size of a continent. She wept until the sun was gone and the first stars came out hard and white above the bruise of the sky. Then she stopped weeping. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She climbed up out of the crater. She set up the small canvas tent that the cobbler's wife had given her, the one that had belonged to her husband. from a prospecting trip he had taken before they were married. She lit a small fire from dry pine needles and old twigs. She ate the heel of bread. She drank water from her tin cup water she had drawn from a creek a quarter-mile back along the road. She wrapped herself in her one blanket. She lay down. She did not sleep, not really, but she rested. And in the long, cold hours before dawn, she made herself a small promise. She did not know yet what the promise meant. She did not know yet what she would do. But the promise was this: she would not be erased. Not by grief, not by poverty, not by the wind, not by anyone. The next morning, she opened the carpet bag the cobbler's wife had given her, looking for her sewing kit, because the hem of her morning dress had torn on a bramble during the long walk up. She did not find the sewing kit. She found something else. At the bottom of the bag, wrapped in a piece of brown paper and tied with twine, was a small leather book. She did not recognize it at first. She turned it over in her hands. The leather was worn smooth at the corners. The spine was cracked. There was no title. She untied the twine. It was a journal. Elias's journal. Her hands began to shake. She had not known he kept a journal. In 11 years of marriage, she had never seen him write in one. She had thought she knew everything about him. The small things. The way he hummed under his breath when he was thinking. The way he salted his eggs. The way he turned the page of the newspaper with his thumb and not his fingers. She had not known about the debts. She had not known about the sickness. And now she had not known about this. She sat down on the cold ground beside the dead pine. She opened the book. The first entry was dated March of 1907, almost a year and a half before he died. The handwriting was neat at the start. It grew shakier toward the end. She read. The doctor confirmed it today. The first entry said, consumption. The same disease that took my mother in '94. He says I have a year, perhaps 2. Perhaps less. He says the lungs are already marked. He says I should put my affairs in order. He says I should tell my wife. I will not tell her. Maren stopped reading. She closed her eyes. The wind moved across the open ground and stirred her hair. A long minute passed. Then she opened her eyes and read on. I will not tell her the entry continued because she is 28 years old, and she has already lost her mother and her father and her brother to the typhoid in '96. And I will not be the next loss she has to carry while I am still here to carry it for her. Let her have me whole for as long as I am whole. The dying I will do in private. The fear I will keep in this book. She will know soon enough. There will be plenty of time for her grief when I am gone. For now, let her have her husband and not her invalid. Maren pressed the book against her chest. She rocked back and forth on the cold ground beside the dead pine. The crow called again from somewhere in the high branches of the live trees beyond the property line. The wind smelled of snow. She read on. There were entries about doctor visits, entries about medicines that did not work, entries about coughing up blood in the back room of the cobbler's shop while Maren was at the market, entries about borrowing money from the bank in Bellows Falls, telling the loan officer he needed it for seed and equipment, signing his name to a paper he knew he would never live to repay. There were entries about long walks in the woods alone, where he could cough as hard as he needed to without her hearing. There were entries that made her weep all over again, sitting there in the cold, with the dead pine looming above her. Entries about how he watched her sleep at night and counted the freckles on her shoulder and tried to memorize her face so he could carry it with him into whatever came next. Entries about how he wished he had given her children. Entries about how he wished he had been a better man, a richer man, a man who could have left her something more than debts and a piece of bad land. And then she came to an entry dated September of 1907, and her hands began to shake all over again, because this entry was different. This entry was not about his sickness. This entry was about the land. I went out to the property today the entry began, the first time in 3 years. I do not know why I waited so long. Perhaps because I knew what I would feel when I saw it again. Perhaps because I knew what I would have to face. It is still there. The pine is still there. The crater is still there. The bones of the place my father wanted to die on are still there. He used to take me out there when I was a boy. He used to walk me along the property line and put his hand on my shoulder and tell me, "This is yours someday, son. This is what your grandfather built, and what my brother lost, and what I will give back to you." He died before he could tell me how. He died in 98, the same summer the lightning took the king pine. And on his last night in the bed, in the back room of the farmhouse, he held my wrist, and he said to me, "Elias, Elias, the 10 acres. The 10 acres are still ours. Get them back. Make it right. Make my brother answer for what he did." I promised him. I gave him my word. He died with my hand on his wrist, and I gave him my word. I have not kept it. For 10 years I have not kept it. I have been a coward. I have let my brother spread out across the valley with his fine barns and his fat cattle. And I have looked the other way because he is my brother, and because I did not have the strength in me to do what needed to be done. But I have a year now, perhaps 2, perhaps less. And I have a wife who will be alone when I am gone. And I will not leave this earth without keeping my word to my father. I bought the 10 acres back today, the whole parcel, the crater and the pine and the rock and the scrub. I bought it from the bank that took it from him, and I paid with money. I do not have money I borrowed against a life I will not live to enjoy. And I will not tell Marin, not yet. Because if I tell her, I will have to tell her everything. And I cannot tell her everything. Not yet. The land is hers now. If I die before I can do what I came to do, the land is hers. And perhaps she will find a way to do what I could not. Perhaps she is stronger than I have been. Perhaps a Holbrook woman can finish what a Holbrook man began. I love her. God help me, I love her. And I have lied to her for 2 years. And I cannot stop lying to her now. Forgive me. Marin closed the book. She did not weep this time. She sat very still beside the dead pine, with the wind coming down off the northern peaks, and she felt something inside her that she had never felt before. It was not grief. It was not anger. It was something colder than either. It was the slow, hard click of a piece of iron settling into place inside her chest. The land was not a parting gift. The land was a debt. The land was a promise her husband had made to his dying father and had not been able to keep, and had passed to her on the last breath of his life. The pine, the pine, the pine. That was what he had whispered when he died. Not a delirium, not a meaningless syllable. A message, a direction. Look to the pine. Go to the pine. The pine is where the answer is. She stood up. She wiped her eyes, though she had not been crying. She looked at the great fallen tree, the dead king lying across her 10 acres, and she did not see a ruin anymore. She saw the last word of a man who had loved her. She saw an inheritance. She saw something she had been chosen to carry. She did not yet know what she would do. She did not yet know how a 29-year-old widow with 17 cents in her pocket was gonna make right whatever had been made wrong. But she knew with a certainty that surprised her that she would not be leaving this land. Not for the winter. Not for the spring. Not ever if she could help it. She put the journal carefully back into the carpet bag. She wrapped it in the brown paper. She tied the twine. She set the bag inside the canvas tent, and she went out to gather firewood because the day was getting on, and the wind was getting harder, and she had work to do. 6 days passed. She lived in the tent. She drew water from the creek in the tin cup and a battered pail she found half buried at the edge of the property. She ate the last of the bread, and then she ate nothing for a day and a half until a farmer's wife from down the road, a woman named Mrs. Thornberry, whose face was as soft and pink as a peach, walked up the long track with a basket of cornbread and salt pork and a jar of preserved beans. She did not say much. She set the basket inside the tent. She looked at Marin the way a person looks at a small animal she has found in a trap, with sorrow and helplessness. And she patted Marin's shoulder once and walked back down the track without a word. Marin ate the cornbread. She rationed the salt pork. She made the beans last 3 days. She walked the property in the daylight. She learned its contours. The slope that fell away to the east, the ridge of stone along the northern edge, the patch of black willow at the south, where a tiny seasonal stream cut through, the places where the wind hit hardest, and the places where it dropped away to a strange stillness. She walked the length of the dead pine end to end and counted her paces. 112. The trunk was longer than the parlor of any house in Pine Hollow. She studied the crater. She climbed down into it and pressed her palm against the cold, dark earth of its walls, and she felt the deep cellular cold of the ground, and she felt how the wind that howled across the open land above did not enter the crater. Inside the crater, the air was still. Inside the crater, the cold was a different cold, a patient cold, a cold that did not bite. She did not know yet what this meant, but she filed it away. On the 7th day, the wagon came up the track. She heard it before she saw it, the creak of the axles, the slow, heavy clop of a draft horse. She came out of the tent and stood at the edge of the road and watched it climb toward her. She knew who it would be before it arrived. There was only one man it could be. Silas Holbrook drove his wagon right to the property line and stopped it there. He did not drive onto the land. He sat up on the bench in his fine wool coat and his fur-trimmed hat, and he held the reins loose in his thick, gloved hands. and he looked at her the way a man looks at a piece of livestock he is considering buying. He was 45 years old, 16 years older than Marin, 6 years older than Elias had been when he died. He had Elias's eyes, the same hazel, the same set, but there was nothing in them of Elias's quiet. Silas's eyes were a calculator, the eyes of a man who had been adding up the world since he was a boy and had decided long ago that he was the only sum that mattered. He cleared his throat. The sound was a small ceremony, an officious courtesy, the noise of a man preparing to dispense charity. Marin, he said. Silas, she said. A silence stretched between them. Somewhere in the northern peaks, an avalanche of cloud was building. The light on the ground was thin and sharp. I have come to help you, Silas said. He did not get down from the wagon. He spoke down to her from the bench. The wind moved his fur trim. He looked across her 10 acres, and his eyes traveled along the dead pine and lingered for a moment at the crater, and came back to her, and there was a thing in his face that was not pity and not contempt, but a third thing she did not have a name for, the look of a man assessing a problem. This is no place for a woman, Silas said. This is no place for a widow alone. It was not a place for Elias, and he was twice your size. The first snow will be here inside the month. There is no shelter. There is no well. There is nothing. She said nothing. She let him talk. I will take it off your hands, he said, out of respect for my brother's memory. $50. Cash. Today. Enough to get you a room in town for the winter. Enough to find some respectable work. A kindness. He said the word kindness as if it were a heavy coin he was reluctantly parting with. He waited. The wind moved across the open ground. Marin looked past him. She looked at the pine. She thought of the journal in the carpet bag inside the tent. She thought of Elias on his last night whispering 3 words. She thought of Bertram Holbrook dying 10 summers ago with his hand on his son's wrist, asking for a thing to be made right. She thought of $50, the price of being erased, the price of admitting that she liked the land was worthless, the price of letting her husband's last promise die a second death on a Tuesday afternoon in October. She brought her gaze back to Silas's face. No, she said. The wind moved past her ears. He blinked. The composure of his face fractured for one instant. Then it set again, harder. A muscle worked in his jaw. What did you say? I said no. Silas leaned forward on the bench. The wagon creaked under his shifting weight. Marin, he said. His voice was low now. A different register. The patience of a man speaking to a child who has refused to come in out of the rain. Be sensible. The first snow is coming. You cannot live here. You will freeze in that tent. You will starve. Do you understand what winter does to a woman alone on the side of a mountain? Do you understand what I'm offering you? $50 is a great deal of money for a woman with nothing. Yes, she said. It is a great deal of money. Then take it. No. He stared at her. The ruddy color rose in his cheeks. She could see him calculating again, his eyes moving over her, reassessing, looking for the lever. He had expected this to be easy. A widow, a grieving woman, a piece of paper signed in 5 minutes, and the last troublesome remnant of his brother's life swept clean off the map. It was not easy. He did not know why. "You are a foolish woman," he said. The word foolish fell flat between them. "I am not foolish," she said. "I am not selling." Silas straightened on the bench. The patience went out of his face. What replaced it was something colder. The look of a man who has been refused, and who is not in his own private accounting ever refused. "Fine," he said. The word came out clipped. Then starve. Freeze. Don't come crying to me when the snow is up to your waist and there is no firewood in the world. Don't come begging at my door. Don't come begging at the church. You have made your choice." He gathered the reins. He did not look at her again. The wagon turned in the road. The horse's breath made a white plume in the cold air. Silas drove away without a backward glance, and the dust that his wheels kicked up settled slowly in the still cold air. And Maren stood at the edge of the road and watched him go, until he was out of sight beyond the curve of the maples. She breathed. She felt her hands shake. The shaking was not fear. The shaking was the aftermath of a thing she had done that she had not known she was capable of doing. She had said no to a Holbrook man. She had said no to $50. She had said no to the only door out of the cold she had been offered. And the dam this time did not break. The dam held. She walked back to the tent. She knelt and opened the carpet bag and took out the journal. She held it for a long minute. Then she put it away again. She had work to do. She did not know yet what the work was, but the work was waiting. That same evening, just as the light was leaving the sky, she heard another sound on the road. Not the heavy creak of Silas's wagon. A lighter sound. A peddler's cart, high and narrow, drawn by a single tired mule. The man on the bench wore a battered felt hat and a coat of patched canvas. His face was weathered the color of saddle leather. He was perhaps 50, perhaps 60, the kind of man whose age you could not guess because the road had used him hard. A traveling merchant, the kind that had once been common in these hills, going from farm to farm with thread and needles and tin cups and small tools, sleeping in barns, eating what was offered. He pulled the mule up at the edge of the property and tipped his hat. "Evening, missus. Evening. You the widow Holbrook?" "I am." He nodded slowly. He looked down the long line of the dead pine. He whistled low. "That is a tree," he said. "Yes, it is." He climbed down from the cart. He did not come onto the land. He stood in the road and rested his hand on the mule's neck. The mule blew steam through its nostrils and shifted its weight from one back hoof to the other. "I am sorry for your loss, missus. Your husband was a fine man. I sold him a pair of bootlaces 3 years back. He gave me a glass of cider for my mule." She did not know what to say to this. She nodded. The peddler chewed something inside his cheek. He looked at the road. He looked at the pine. He looked back at her. "Forgive me, missus. It is not my business. But a man hears things on this road. A man hears talk from one farm to the next. And I have been hearing talk this last week all up and down this valley that I think you should know." "What talk?" The peddler did not answer right away. He took off his hat. He turned it slowly in his hands. The wind was rising again. The mule shook its harness. "There is a man," he said, "who has been buying up land in this valley. Quietly. Not making a fuss about it. 3 farms in the last 6 months. The Pemberton place. The lower 40 of the Caldwell farm. The whole stretch out by the bend in the river that the Granger family used to own. Paid cash. Paid generously. $200 in one case. $300 in another. More than the land is worth by twice over." Marin went very still. The peddler kept turning his hat. "It is your husband's brother, Mrs. Silas Holbrook. He is the one buying." "Why?" "That is the question. That is what folks have been asking. Why is Silas Holbrook, who already owns half this valley, paying $300 an acre for land that nobody in their right mind would pay $100 for? Why is he doing it quietly? Why is he doing it now?" "I do not know," she said. The peddler put his hat back on. He looked at her steadily. His eyes were a faded blue, the color of denim that has been washed many times. "I will tell you what I think, Mrs. I will tell you what a peddler hears going from farm to farm. There is talk in Brattleboro. There is talk in Bellows Falls. The railroad is coming. The Boston and Montreal line is laying track north out of the Connecticut River. And the survey crews are working through this valley right now. They have been seen at the Pemberton place. They have been seen at the bend in the river. They are following a route, and the route runs through this valley, and the route runs straight through your 10 acres, Mrs. Straight through." The wind moved across the open ground. The mule shifted again. "He came to you," the peddler said. "Did he not? Your husband's brother. He came and offered you $50. Yes." The peddler nodded slowly. "He will be back," he said. "When 50 does not work, he will come with 100. When 100 does not work, he will come with 2. He will not come with 3. He will come with something else. A man who has the patience to buy 3 farms in 6 months, and who comes to a grieving widow with $50 while he is paying $300 to others is not a man who is offering you a kindness, Mrs. He is a man who is hoping you do not know what you have. What do I have?" The peddler smiled very slightly. A small, kind smile sat at the edges. "You have a great deal more than 10 acres of rock, Mrs. You have the throat of a valley. You have the only piece of ground that the railroad cannot go around. You have, if I am right, a piece of paper in that 10 of yours that is worth more than the whole of Silas Holbrook's barns put together." The wind dropped. The world held still for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. The peddler shrugged. He climbed back up onto his cart. "Because your husband gave my mule a glass of cider," he said. "Because I do not like to see a widow cheated. Because the world is cold and getting colder, and a man with a small kindness in his bag should put it down where it is needed." He clucked his tongue. The mule began to walk. He did not look back. The cart rolled away down the long track, and the sound of the axles faded, and Marin stood alone at the edge of her 10 acres in the failing light. The dead pines stretched across the slope behind her. The crater opened at its head like a dark mouth. The first true cold of the season was coming down off the northern peaks. She thought about the journal in the tent. She thought about Silas in his fine wool coat sitting up on the wagon bench, paying her $50 for the throat of a valley. She thought about Bertram Holbrook dying with his hand on Elias's wrist. The 10 acres. The 10 acres are still ours. Get them back. Make it right. Make my brother answer for what he did. She thought about Elias whispering 3 words. The pine. The pine. The pine. She walked back to the tent. She knelt and lit the small lamp the cobbler's wife had given her. The flame jumped, steadied through a small, warm circle of light across the canvas wool. She took out the journal. She set it on her lap. She did not open it. She held it. Outside, the wind began to rise again, and somewhere in the high branches of the live trees beyond her property line, a single crow called out 3 times into the gathering dark. She was 29 years old. She had 17 cents in her pocket. She had a tent and a blanket and a tin cup and a deed. And she understood now, a fight on her hands. A fight with a man who had been adding up the world since he was a boy, and who had decided long ago that she did not figure into the sum. She closed her eyes. She made him a promise of her own. She did not say it out loud. She did not need to. The wind heard it. The pine heard it. The crater heard it. And somewhere in the cold ground behind the white clappered church on the hill, Elias heard it too. She would not be erased. Not by grief. Not by poverty. Not by the wind. Not by Silas Holbrook. The first snow was coming. She had work to do. The first snow came on a Wednesday morning, 3 days after the peddler had driven away down the long track. It wasn't much of a snow, a thin powdering, the kind of snow that falls and melts within the hour and leaves the ground darker than it was before. But Marin stood outside the tent in her thin city boots and watched the flakes settle on the back of the dead pine. And she understood that the first snow was a messenger, not a guest. The first snow was a footstep on the porch. The thing that came after it would knock down the door. She had perhaps 4 weeks, perhaps 5 if the season was kind. Nobody in Vermont had ever known the season to be kind. She stood in the crater that morning, the way she had stood in it many times now, with her back against the cold, packed earth of the wall. The wind came over the lip of the crater and made its high, keening sound. But inside the crater, the air was almost still. She had begun to notice this. She had begun to study it. There was a pocket inside the crater where the wind did not reach, a quiet place 6 feet below the level of the ground. And the air inside that pocket was warmer than the air outside. Not warm. Nothing in this country was warm in October, but warmer. 3 degrees, 5 degrees, enough to feel against the skin of her face. She pressed her bare palm against the crater wall. She held it there until the cold of the earth bled into her hand. It was a strange cold. A patient cold, not the angry blade cold of the wind. The earth was not fighting the season. The earth was holding its own temperature somewhere down deep, the way a person holds a small candle in cupped hands against the dark. She turned and looked at the trunk of the pine. It lay 6 feet from the lip of the crater. The cut end nearest to her where the lightning had ripped it from its roots was black and ragged, a great splintered wound. The trunk itself was a wall of solid wood, 6 feet thick at this end, tapering but only slightly for the first 30 feet. The bark was deeply furrowed, dark gray, scaled like the hide of some ancient reptile that had lain down to sleep and forgotten to wake. She had heard her grandmother tell stories when Maren was a child of 7 or 8. Stories from a time before sawmills and clapboard houses, of people on the western plains who had cut their homes into the side of hills, of folk in the deep woods who had wintered inside hollow sycamores when their cabins burned. The stories were always told with a small shake of the head, the way you tell a story about something done by people who did not know any better. Conventional wisdom in this part of the country was to build high, to raise your house on stone pilings, get the floor up off the frozen ground, keep the snow at bay. To burrow into the earth was to invite the damp, the frost, the grave. Maren stood in the crater. She felt the patient cold of the earth. She listened to the wind that did not reach her down here. She looked at the trunk of the pine, that great wooden wall 6 feet thick at the cut end, and she thought a thought that was not the thought of a sensible woman. She thought, what if it is not a wall? What if it is a vessel? The wood of a tree is the most patient material in the world. It grows slowly. It dies slowly. Even after it dies, it gives up its substance only under sustained labor. The cellulose and the lignin do not surrender to a single strong blow. They surrender to time, to fire, to the long patient working of an axe. She had no one to help her. She had no money to hire help. She had no horses to drag the trunk into pieces. No team of men to fell smaller trees and build her a cabin in the conventional way. She had what was here. She had 10 acres. She had a dead pine. She had a crater. She had her own 2 hands. And she had a husband's promise to keep. She climbed up out of the crater. She walked back to the tent. She knelt and opened the small leather toolkit Elias had owned, the one the creditors had not bothered to take because it was old and worn and looked worth nothing. Inside was a hand axe, a small wood saw with a chipped tooth, a pry bar, a short adze with a curved blade, the kind that had been used to shape ship timbers 100 years ago, and was now used by old farmers who had inherited it and did not know quite what to do with it. There was also a heavy iron mallet and a thin chisel. She laid them out on the canvas floor of the tent. She looked at them in the gray light coming through the open flap. It was not enough. She knew that. She knew it the way a soldier knows when his rifle has only 3 rounds left and the line is still coming forward. But it was what she had. She picked up the hand axe. She walked to the dead pine. She stood beside the cut end. She raised the axe and she swung. The blade bounced. It did not bite. It did not chip. It bounced off the seasoned wood the way a ball bounces off a stone wall, and the impact ran up her arm into her shoulder, and she nearly dropped the axe. She set her feet again. She raised the axe higher. She swung harder. It bounced. She swung again, and again, and again. By the 10th swing, she had taken a small white scar out of the bark. By the 20th, she had cut perhaps a finger's width into the wood. Her shoulders were burning. Her palms were stinging. The wood was as hard as iron. She kept swinging. She swung that axe for the better part of 2 days. By the end of the first day, the bark on a small section of the trunk had been peeled back, and beneath it the heartwood was exposed. By the end of the second day, she had a doorway-sized patch of bare wood. Her hands had gone past blisters. The blisters had broken and bled and become raw. The blood had dried, cracked, opened again, dried again. Her shoulders had a kind of pain that was no longer a sensation, but a sound, a low, constant ringing in the muscles. That night she sat in the tent and held her hands in her lap and could not close her fingers around the tin cup. She had to drink the cold water by tilting it against her lips. She did not eat. She could not lift the cornbread to her mouth. She lay down in her blanket with her arms straight at her sides, and she did not sleep. But she rested the way an animal rests after a long run. The third morning she woke and her hands had locked into half claws. She could not straighten them. She held them over the small fire she had built for tea. She flexed them slowly, one finger at a time, and the skin cracked in fresh places, and she made a small sound through her teeth. That was not quite a word. She went back to the pine. She had peeled the bark. The bark had been the easy part. The heartwood was waiting. She raised the axe. It bounced. She swung again. It bounced. By mid-morning, her axe had not removed a single chip larger than a coin. The wood was a decade dead and seasoned in the open air, hardened by 10 winters of frost and 10 summers of sun. It was no longer tree. It was something between tree and stone. Her axe was not made for this work. Nobody's axe was made for this work. She sat down beside the trunk. She set the axe on the ground. She put her face in her bleeding hands, and for the first time since she had walked up the long track from Pine Hollow, she let herself believe what everyone in the valley had told her. That she could not do this. That she was a fool. That Silas had been right, and the constable had been right. And Mrs. Thornberry's sad pink face had been right. And the only thing waiting for her on this hillside was a slow death by cold. She sat there for a long time. The sun crawled across the gray sky. The wind moved through the bare maples beyond the property line. The crow called from somewhere, 3 calls, always 3. And then her eye fell on the lightning scar. It ran the length of the trunk. A long, dark gash where the bolt had hit 10 years ago and split the wood from the crown to the roots. The wood inside the scar was different from the wood around it. The wood inside the scar was black. It was charred. The lightning had not just split the tree. The lightning had burned it. She got slowly to her feet. Every joint in her body made a sound. She walked along the trunk to the place where the scar was deepest. She knelt. She touched the black wood. It crumbled. Not all of it. The deepest layer of char was hard, glassy, but the surface of the burned wood, the part that had been transformed by fire, was brittle. It came away in her fingers in flakes and crumbs. She pressed harder. A larger piece broke off in her hand. She sat back on her heels. The fire had done in one stroke what her axe could not do in 2 days. She stood up. She walked back to the tent. She picked up the small iron mallet and a pile of dry tinder she had gathered the day before, dry pine needles and old curls of birch bark. She walked back to the trunk. She knelt at the place where she had peeled the bark, the patch of bare heartwood she had been trying to chop into for 2 days. She built a small fire against the wood. She did not let it rage. She built it small and patient. A handful of tinder, a few twigs, then a few thicker sticks. The flame caught and licked up against the seasoned heartwood, and at first the wood would not burn at all. It only smoked. The smoke was white and thick and smelled of resin. She fed the fire carefully. She kept it small. After an hour, the wood beneath the flame had begun to char. After 2 hours, the char had grown into a black patch the size of her 2 hands. After 4 hours, the char was the size of a serving platter and was perhaps half an inch deep. She let the fire burn for another hour. Then she hauled water from the creek in the battered pail, and she doused the flames. The wood hissed. Steam rose. The black patch sat there glistening wet, dark as coal. She picked up the adze. She swung it. The curved blade bit deep into the softened carbonized wood, and a great black chunk fell away. A sound came out of her. It was not a word. It was a small, hard sound. A sound of triumph. The sound a hunter makes when the arrow finds its mark. She had not made that sound in years. She had not known she still had it in her. She raised the adze and she swung again. Another chunk fell away. Another. The work was slow. The work was filthy. Within 10 minutes, her hands were black to the wrists and her face was streaked with soot. But the work was working. The wood was coming away. She had found a way in. That night, she sat in the tent and ate the last of Mrs. Thornberry's cornbread, and her hands trembled. But they could close around the bread, and she chewed slowly, because every muscle in her jaw was tired, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not happiness. Happiness was on the far side of a country she could not yet see. But something that was a cousin of happiness. A small, cold brightness. The brightness of a person who has been told a thing cannot be done, and who has just discovered that the thing can be done after all. The next morning, she began the work that would eat the next 3 weeks of her life. Burn. Wait. Douse. Scrape. Burn. Wait. Douse. Scrape. She fell into the rhythm of it the way a woman falls into the rhythm of churning butter or kneading bread, except that this was a rhythm of fire and char and aching shoulders. Every morning she built a small fire against the inside face of her growing hollow. Every afternoon she let it burn down, doused it, and went in with the adze. Every evening she hauled out the black chunks and the loose char and the wet pine chips and added them to the slowly growing mountain of debris outside what would be her doorway. The hollow grew. It grew the way a thought grows, slowly at first, almost invisibly, and then in sudden surges. By the end of the first week, she could stand inside the trunk if she stooped. By the end of the second week, she could stand upright in the deepest part. By the end of the third week, she had carved a chamber inside the dead pine that was 8 feet wide and 10 feet long, and almost 7 feet at the highest point of the curved ceiling. The walls of her growing room were the inside of the tree. The grain ran in long, beautiful rivers around her, dark with soot, but where she had scrubbed it clean with a stiff wire brush. a deep red color, the color of old wine, the color of the inside of a heart. The wood was thick, inches thick on every side, a fortress of wood that the wind could not move and the cold could not pierce. She slept in the tent at night, but she lived in the hollow during the day. The hollow had a smell that was unlike anything she had ever known. It was the smell of wood smoke and pine resin and damp earth, but it was also something else. The smell of a place that had been opened. A place that had not been entered for 10 years and was being entered now slowly by patient hands. There was a quietness inside the hollow that did not exist anywhere else on the property. The wind that scoured the 10 acres did not reach into the hollow. The wind broke against the outside of the trunk and rolled away. Her body changed. The blisters on her hands became calluses. The calluses became a thick second skin, a hide that no longer split or bled. The pain in her shoulders shifted from a high singing to a low, steady hum, and then to something that was almost not pain at all, but presence. The presence of muscle that she had not known she possessed. Her arms grew lean and ropey beneath her sleeves. Her face grew thinner but not gaunt. It was the leanness of a person who is using her body for what a body is for. She had never been so tired. She had also never been so strong. She did not know it then, but she was being remade. Grief had hollowed her out, and now the work was filling her with something new. She had been a wife. She was becoming something else. She did not yet have a name for what she was becoming, but she felt it late at night when she stood inside her growing hollow and pressed her palm against the curved wooden wall and felt the silence of the dead king holding her like a cupped hand. It was on the 17th day of the work that she found the box. She had decided to deepen the floor of the hollow. The natural curve of the trunk left her standing on the lower inside wall, and she wanted a flat floor level and steady. To do that, she would need to dig down into the earth itself, into the crater that opened at the head of the trunk. And she would need to extend the floor of her chamber out into the crater to make a sunken entryway, a sheltered courtyard. She had begun the digging that morning. She used the shovel. The earth at the bottom of the crater was packed hard. The shovel rang against stones. She worked slowly, prying out the larger rocks, piling them at the side to use later for a stone floor and for the low walls of the entryway berm. She had dug perhaps a foot down when the shovel struck something that was neither stone nor wood. She felt the impact in her hands. A hollow ring, a metallic note. She knelt. She set the shovel aside. She brushed away the loose dirt with her fingers. It was a tin box. It was old. The lid was rusted. The corners were eaten away. It had been buried perhaps a foot below the surface of the crater bottom, in a place where the disturbed earth from the original lightning fall had settled long ago and packed down hard. She could not tell how long it had been there. 5 years, 10, 20. She did not know. She lifted it out of the hole. It was heavy. There was something inside. She carried it to a flat rock at the edge of the crater. She set it down. She tried to open it. The lid was rusted shut. She fetched the chisel and the small iron mallet, and she pried at the seam gently, the way a woman pries the stuck lid off a jar of preserves. She did not want to break what was inside. The lid came off with a small, dry crack. Inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth that had gone yellow with age, were three things: a small canvas tool roll tied with twine, a folded sheaf of papers sealed inside another piece of oilcloth, and a single short letter also wrapped the paper of it brittle and brown at the edges. She lifted out the tool roll first. She untied the twine. She unrolled it on the rock. Inside were tools, a short adze smaller than her own and much older, a draw knife with a wooden handle worn smooth by use, a set of small chisels in graduated sizes, a folding rule, a carpenter's pencil, the lead long since broken. The tools were rusted, but they were good tools. They had been made by a craftsman, and they had been used by a craftsman, and they had been wrapped and oiled and put away by a man who had loved them. She set the tool roll aside. She picked up the sheaf of papers. She unwrapped the oilcloth carefully. The papers inside were pages from a sketchbook. Heavy paper, slightly foxed at the edges, but still good. She unfolded the first sheet. It was a drawing. It was a drawing of a tree. She stared at it. It was a drawing of this tree, the pine, the very pine that lay on its side in front of her now. The drawing showed it as it had been when it was still standing, a great living monarch with a crown of green needles spreading out against a hatched sky. The base of the trunk was sketched with care. The drawing was beautiful. It was the work of a man who had stood in front of this tree and looked at it for a long time. In the lower right corner of the page, in a small, careful hand, was a note. The white pine on the upper parcel, property of the Holbrook family, the largest tree in the county. May she stand 1,000 years more. B. Holbrook, June 1885. B. Holbrook, Bertram, Elias's father. Maren sat very still on the cold, flat rock at the edge of the crater. The wind moved her hair. The drawing trembled in her hands. She turned to the second page. It was a sketch of a house, but not a house that had ever been built. The sketch showed a small structure low to the ground with thick walls. A house carved into a hillside. A house with a turf roof and a chimney pipe. The drawing was crude in places, the work of a man who was not a draftsman, but the idea was clear. A house dug into the earth. A house using the slope as a wall. A house insulated by the ground. In the corner, the same careful hand had written a note. An old way. From the western plains. They live in this kind of dwelling and they do not freeze. The earth holds the heat. Worth thinking on. B.H. She turned to the third page. It was a sketch of the pine. But not the pine standing, the pine fallen. The drawing showed the great trunk on its side, with a small chamber sketched into the cut end. A doorway. A chimney pipe rising from the spine. A figure of a person standing inside, drawn very small to give the scale. The note below was longer. If the king ever falls, this is what to do with her. Do not waste the timber. Do not cut her up for boards. Leave her where she lies. Hollow her. Live inside her. The wood will hold the cold out. The earth will hold the cold out. A man could live inside a tree like that for 50 winters and never know the snow. A man could live there with his wife, with his children. The land does not need a fine house. The land needs a quiet one. B.H. April, 1888. Maren put the papers down on the rock. She put her hands over her face. She did not weep. She had passed beyond weeping. What she felt was something quieter and stranger. It was the feeling of standing in a room and discovering suddenly that the room had been built around her by hands she had never met. Bertram Holbrook had drawn her house. 20 years ago, he had stood on this very ground beside the still living pine, and he had imagined what to do if the great tree ever fell. He had drawn the very thing she was building. He had sketched the doorway in the cut end, the chimney through the spine, the small figure standing inside the curved walls. He had known, and he had told someone. He had told his son. She lifted the small letter, the third thing in the box. She unwrapped the oilcloth. The paper crackled softly as she opened it. The handwriting was Bertram's, the same careful hand that had labeled the drawings. It was dated August of 1898, 2 months before the lightning had felled the tree, 2 months before Bertram himself had died. To my son Elias, the letter began. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the king pine is gone. I do not know which will fall first. I am old and tired, and the doctor says my heart is failing, and I have heard the thunder out of the northern peaks every summer for 40 years. And I know that one of these summers a bolt is going to find that tree. She is the tallest thing on this ridge. She has been calling lightning for 200 years, and we have been lucky. The luck will run out. I have buried this box at the foot of her in the crater that her roots will leave when she goes. I have buried it deep enough that the rains will not reach it. Inside are my tools and my drawings. They are yours now. They are also instructions. You know what your brother did in '93. You know what he took from us. You know what I cannot prove and what no court will hear, because the signature on the deed is mine, and any man with eyes can see that it is mine, and there is no living person who can swear that I was too sick to write my own name on the day that paper was signed. I cannot get the land back. I have tried. I have not the strength left, and I do not have the years. But you are young. You are stubborn. You have your mother's spine, and the 10 acres at the head of the parcel are still ours. Silas could not take that from us because the deed for the upper parcel was registered separately by your grandfather in '51. And Silas does not know that. He thinks he took everything. He did not. The 10 acres are still ours, and the king pine stands on them, and when she falls, she will fall on the best soil on the whole slope. The crater she leaves will be a foundation. The trunk she leaves will be a wall. Build there, son. Build the house I drew. Live there with a good woman. Raise your children there. Make the land mean something again. Make my brother's son look at the smoke from your chimney and know that he did not win. I love you. Forgive me for what I could not finish. The Holbrook men have always asked the next Holbrook man to finish what we could not. It is not fair. It is the only inheritance I have. Your father, Bertram. Maren read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully along its old creases. She put it back into the oilcloth. She put it back into the tin box. She put the drawings beside it. She closed the rusted lid. She sat on the flat rock at the edge of the crater for a long time. The sun crawled across the gray sky. The wind moved across the open ground. She did not feel cold. She did not feel anything. She was full to the top of her ribs with a thing that did not have a name. Bertram had known what she was doing. Bertram had known before she was born. The plan that had come to her in the crater. The plan she had thought was her own desperate invention was not hers. It had been waiting in this ground for 10 years, sealed in a tin box, drawn on heavy paper, in a careful hand. Elias had not told her. Why had Elias not told her? She thought about that for a long time. And then she understood. Elias had not told her because he had not been able to do it himself. He had carried the plan for 10 years. He had known where the box was buried. He had known what was inside it. And he had not had the strength, or the courage, or the time. He had let his brother spread out across the valley while he, Elias, had quietly courted a woman in town and married her and bought her a clock and a brass bedstead and a patchwork quilt, and had not told her because to tell her was to admit that he had not yet done what his father had asked him to do. He had bought the 10 acres back in the last year of his life with money he did not have. He had meant to come up here. He had meant to dig up the box. He had meant to hand it to her on a clean Sunday afternoon and say, "Here is what we are going to do together. Here is the inheritance. Here is the work." He had run out of time. The land is yours now. He had written that in the journal. The land is yours now. If I die before I can do what I came to do, the land is yours. And perhaps she will find a way to do what I could not. He had not known that she would. He had only hoped. She held the box on her lap for a long minute. Then she stood up. Her legs were stiff from sitting. She carried the box back to the tent. She set it inside beside the carpet bag beside the journal. She covered it with her blanket. She walked back to the trunk. She picked up her ads. She got back to work. The work had a different shape now. It was not her work alone anymore. It was not the desperate invention of a widow with 17 cents in her pocket. It was a thing that had been begun by a man 20 years ago and continued by his son for 10 years. And now passed to her, and she was the third hand on the same shovel. She was finishing a house her father-in-law had drawn before she had ever met his son. She cleared the chamber. She built up the floor with packed earth and flat stones from the creek. She extended the doorway out into the crater, building low walls of the dug earth on either side, lining them with stones, creating a sunken entry that would be sheltered on 3 sides from the wind. She fitted a small door of salvaged planks, plank by plank, the planks taken from a tumble-down barn at the abandoned Pemberton place, a quarter-mile down the road, where nobody was watching anymore. She found, miraculously, a single small pane of glass at the old town dump, half buried in dead leaves, unbroken. She fitted it into a small hole in the trunk on the side opposite the door. A window. A real window. The light came through it onto the inside wall and lay in a small, bright square on the dark red wood. She built a chimney. The chimney was the hardest thing. She had to vent the small stovepipe she had bought from Mr. Whitfield through the upper curve of the trunk, and she had to do it without setting the wood on fire. She packed clay around the pipe. She layered it with flat stones. She tested it with small fires. She tested it again. She tested it a third time. By the time she was satisfied, the chimney was a thick collar of clay and stone and salvaged tin, and the stovepipe rose a foot above the spine of the log, like a single defiant finger pointed at the gray sky. She did not see another person for 2 weeks. She heard things. A wagon on the road far off never stopping. Voices once carrying on the wind, 2 men talking their words lost to her. The bark of a dog 2 ridges over. The distant ring of an axe in someone else's woodlot. The world was going on beyond the property line. The world had not forgotten her. The world had simply turned its back the way a town turns its back on a thing it has decided it does not understand. She knew what they were saying. She did not have to hear them. The widow on the ridge, the mole woman, the Holbrook fool digging her own grave by inches. They had a name for her now. The peddler had told her. He had stopped once more in passing on his way south for the season, and he had brought her a small sack of dried beans and told her by the way what they were calling her in the taverns, the mole woman. He had said it apologetically. He had said it because she ought to know. She had not been angry. She had nodded. She had given him a tin cup of hot water with the last sliver of her ginger root in it. He had drunk it standing up. He had tipped his hat. He had driven on. The mole woman. It was not a kind name, but it was a name. It was something. The dead are not given names. The dead are forgotten. She was being given a name, and the name said that she was alive. The name said that she was doing a thing they did not understand. She kept working. It was on a Monday morning, 3 weeks into the work, that the second wagon came up the track. She heard it the way she had heard Silas's wagon. The creak of axles. The slow, heavy clop of a horse. She was inside the chamber, scrubbing the soot off a section of the curved wall with the wire brush, when the sound reached her. She set down the brush. She climbed out through the doorway. She walked up to the road. The wagon was not Silas's. It was smaller. The horse was older. The man on the bench was old. He pulled up at the edge of the property. He did not call out. He sat on the bench and looked at her, and at the trunk, and at the small smoke curling up from the stovepipe she had been testing that morning, and his face did not change. He climbed down. He was perhaps 60 years old, perhaps a little more. He was thin and tall with a long white mustache that hung down past the corners of his mouth, and a face the color of old leather. He wore a dark coat that had been good 20 years ago and was still serviceable now. He wore a wide hat. He carried in his left hand a small brown bottle and in his right hand a leather satchel. He walked across the property line. He walked it slowly. He walked it as though he were not certain whether his feet were welcome. He stopped a few paces from her. He looked at her face for a long, quiet moment. "You would be Marin," he said. His voice was low. There was a small Western roughness in it. The voice of a man who had spent some part of his life not in Vermont. "I would," she said. He nodded. He looked at the trunk. He looked at the smoke. He looked at the doorway in the side of the log with the little salvaged door and the small window pane catching the gray light. He looked at the mountain of charcoal and wood chips beside the entrance. He looked at her hands, which were dark with soot and hard with calluses. He looked at her face, which was thin from work and lean and quiet. He nodded again. "I knew your husband," he said. "Not well. I knew his father better." "What is your name?" "Renfield. Otis Renfield. I run the store in town now. The general store. I bought it from old Mr. Whitfield 3 years ago when his back went bad. You may have seen me. I do not get out much. I am not a sociable man. I do not believe we have met." "No," he said. "We have not. Until today." He stood there. He did not say what he had come for. He was not in a hurry. She waited. He held up the small brown bottle. "This is whiskey," he said. "It is good whiskey. Not the kind they sell at the tavern. The kind a man pours when he wants to remember something." He held up the leather satchel. "This is a whetstone. A good one. From Arkansas. The kind that takes an edge that will hold for a season." He looked at her steadily. "I did not come to talk you out of this," he said. "I did not come to offer to help you find a room in town. I did not come to tell you that you are foolish. There are men in this valley who will tell you that. I am not one of them." He took a step closer. "I came because I owe a debt to a man who has been dead 10 years, he said. "And because what I see you doing here is the first true thing that has happened in this valley since he was put in the ground. I came to sharpen your axe, if you will let me." Maren did not answer for a moment. She was looking at the small brown bottle in his hand. She was thinking of Bertram Holbrook and the careful handwriting and the drawings sealed in a tin box. She was thinking of the look on Elias's face on his last night when he had whispered 3 words. She nodded. "Yes," she said. "I will let you." He smiled. It was a small smile. It did not last long, but it was a real one. He came up to the doorway of the hollow. He stooped. He looked inside. He stood there a long time looking at the curved walls and the small fire in the stove and the floor of packed earth and stone. He did not say anything. When he straightened, his eyes were wet at the corners. He turned his face away from her quickly and wiped them with the back of his hand and pretended he had not. She did not pretend with him. She let him keep the small lie. It seemed kind. He sharpened her axe that afternoon. He sat on the flat rock by the crater and worked the whetstone in slow, patient circles. And the sound of the stone on the steel was a clean, steady music. And the edge that he put on the blade was a thing of beauty. He sharpened the adze, too, and the chisels. He worked until the sun was low in the west. Then he opened the bottle. He poured a small measure into a tin cup. He poured another into a second cup. He handed her one. They sat side by side on the flat rock, the dead pines stretching away in front of them, and they drank the whiskey together. And the whiskey was hot and slow, and tasted of oak and smoke and old summers. He said almost to himself, "I served with Bertram Holbrook in the war." She turned her head. He did not look at her. "The Pennsylvania campaign," he said. 63. We went up the road from Emmitsburg together with the 2nd Vermont. We were in the wheat field on the second day. We were on the high ground on the third. He took a ball through the meat of his thigh on the afternoon of the third day, and I dragged him back behind a stone wall, and I held my coat to the wound until the bleeding slowed and we lay there together while the cannon fire went over us. And I have never been as afraid in my life as I was lying behind that wall with him. I have never been as alive either. He sipped the whiskey. He saved my life twice that year. I saved his once. We were friends after the war the way men are friends after a thing like that. Closer than brothers. Closer than blood. He came home to this valley and he started his farm and he raised his boys, and I went west for 30 years and made my fortune badly and came back broke and bought a store. We picked up where we had left off. I saw him every week the last 5 years of his life. We sat by his stove and we drank slowly, and we did not always speak. We did not need to. He turned to her then. His eyes were old and clear. He told me everything he said. About Silas. About the land. About what happened in '93. Marin went very still. The wind moved across the open ground. The stove inside the hollow ticked softly. He did not have to ask her if she wanted to hear it. He could see in her face that she did. It was the panic, he said. The panic of '93. You will not remember it. You were a girl. But it was the worst thing this country had seen since the war. The banks closed. The railroads went into receivership. Half the farms in this valley were mortgaged, and the notes were called all at once. Bertram had borrowed against the lower parcel 10 years before to put up the new barn. The note came due in the spring of '93. He could not pay it. Nobody could pay anything in '93. He paused. He looked at the trunk. Bertram was 65 years old that spring. He had been kicked by a horse the previous winter. The kick had broken his hip, and the hip had not set right, and he had spent 4 months in bed. He came out of the bed in March, walking with 2 canes, weak as a kitten, his hands shaking so bad he could not hold a pen to write his own name. The bank wanted the lower parcel. The bank was gonna take it. He was trying to find a way to refinance, to borrow against the land in a different shape to keep the farm in the family. His son Silas was 30 years old that spring. Silas had married well the year before. He had married into the Caldwell family. Silas was even then a man with a great hunger in him and a small heart. Silas went to the bank in Bellows Falls. Silas told the loan officer that his father had asked him to handle the matter. Silas signed papers. Silas sold the lower parcel. 200 acres. The good lower bottomland that the Holbrook family had cleared in 1840. He sold it for $3,000, and the bank took $2,700 to clear the note, and Silas walked out of the bank with $300 in cash that did not belong to him. $300 in 1893 was a great deal of money. It was enough to start a man on his way. Silas signed the deed of sale himself. He signed his father's name. He had grown up watching his father sign that name. He could do it. He did it. The bank did not look closely because the bank wanted the matter closed and the loan paid off, and because the Holbrook family had been good customers for 40 years, and nobody at the bank was looking for a forgery. They got their money. They closed the file. Bertram did not find out for 6 weeks. When he did find out, Bertram could not act. He was 65 years old. He was crippled. His hands shook. To accuse his own son of forgery was to send his own son to prison. To accuse his own son was to break his own wife's heart, because Cordelia was still alive then. Barely she had another year to live, and the news would have killed her. To accuse his own son was to drag the Holbrook name through every court in the state. He did not accuse him. He swallowed it. He sat in his chair by the stove, and he swallowed it whole, and it killed him slowly over the next 5 years. The thing that killed him was not the broken hip, and not the bad heart, and not the war wound that ached in winter. The thing that killed him was the silence he had to keep in his own house about his own son. He told me. He told me one night 2 months before he died, sitting in that same chair by his stove. He told me, and he made me swear that I would never speak of it. He said the only one who needed to know was Elias, and Elias would be told in his own time. Bertram told Elias in the last week of his life. He held Elias's wrist, and he made him promise. The 10 acres at the head. They were registered separately. Silas does not know they exist as a separate parcel. Silas thinks they were part of the lower 40. They were not. Get them back if you can. Make the land mean something again. Make my brother's son look at your chimney smoke and know he did not win. Silas does not know about the upper parcel. Silas does not know what is in the tin box buried in the crater. Silas does not know what his father drew on heavy paper 20 years ago. Silas only knows that the railroad is coming, and that the throat of the valley belongs to a widow he can frighten for $50. He stopped speaking. The wind had dropped. The light in the west was a long pale yellow. Somewhere down the valley, a bell was ringing, a farm bell calling someone to a late supper. Myron held the tin cup in her hands. She did not drink from it. You knew, she said, quietly. I knew. You let her brother walk through this valley a free man. For 15 years. I gave my word to Bertram. He told me and he made me swear. I have kept the word. She looked at him. Then why are you telling me now? Otis Renfield set down his cup. He looked across the property. He looked at the great fallen trunk and the small chimney and the smoke that was rising thin and steady against the gray sky. He looked at her hands, which were black with soot and hard, with the new calluses of 3 weeks of work. Because Bertram is dead, he said. And Cordelia is dead. And Elias is dead. And there is no one left in this valley who can be hurt by the truth, except Silas himself. And because you, Marin Holbrook, are the first person I have seen in 15 years who is doing what Bertram asked to be done, you are building the house he drew. You are sitting on the throat of the valley. You are not selling. You are not running. He looked at her steadily. You are owed the truth, he said, and the dead are owed a witness. I waited a long time to say these words. I am 61 years old, and my hands are not as steady as they were, and my time is shorter than the time I have already had. I would like to say them, and be done and know that someone living carries them now, besides me. She did not speak. The sun went down behind the western ridge. The cold came up out of the ground. She set her cup down. She turned to him. I will carry them, she said. He nodded. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he did not look like a man who was carrying a great weight. He looked like a man who had set a great weight down. He stood up. He folded his coat tighter around himself. He walked back to the wagon. He climbed up onto the bench. He turned to her one more time before he picked up the reins. "The work you are doing here," he said, "it is a good work. Your husband would be proud. His father would be proud. If you need a man to stand beside you when this thing comes to a head, and it will come to a head, you send word to the store. I will come." He clucked to the horse. The wagon moved. She stood in the road and watched him go. The sky above her was the color of slate. The first true cold of the season was coming in on the wind. The dead pine lay across her 10 acres like the spine of a sleeping god, and the smoke from her chimney rose thin and straight against the dusk. She had 3 weeks until the snow. She had a great deal of work to do, but for the first time since she had walked up the long track from Pine Hollow, she understood that the work she was doing was not only her own. The work belonged to a dead father who had drawn it on heavy paper, to a dead son who had whispered 3 words at the end, to an old soldier who had carried a secret for 15 years and had finally been able to put it down. And it belonged to her now. Maren Holbrook, 29 years old, the mole woman of the upper ridge. She would not be erased. She turned and walked back to the trunk. She had a chimney to test before nightfall. The last week before the snow was the hardest week of her life. She knew the snow was coming. She had felt it in the air for 3 days, that low, dense pressure that settles over the northern country in late November. The kind of weight that makes the crows fly low, and the deer come down out of the high places to nose at the empty cornfields. The sky had thickened. The wind had changed direction twice in 2 days. The air smelled different. Mrs. Thornberry had walked up the track on a Tuesday afternoon with another basket, and she had stood for a moment beside the dead pine and looked at the sky and shaken her head and said only one thing: "It will be Friday, maybe Saturday, no later." Maren had 3 days, maybe 4. She worked from before dawn until after dark. She finished the door. She caulked the seams around the door with a paste of mud and moss and pine resin she had cooked down in a tin pot over her small fire. She fitted the window pane and sealed it. She built the stone hearth inside the chamber, ringing the small iron stove in flat creek stones laid up with clay. She tested the chimney 3 more times. She fed the stove with the dry pine she had been splitting at every spare moment for the last week. She stacked firewood against the root ball outside a great long rick of it, enough for a month if she was careful, 2 months if she was sparing. On Thursday, she dragged the canvas tent up over the back of the trunk and lashed it down with rope, creating a second skin, a windbreak that would also catch the snow and hold it as insulation. On Friday morning, before the light was full in the sky, she swept out the chamber one last time. She laid down a bed of fresh pine boughs in the corner, soft and fragrant. She covered the boughs with her blanket. She set her tin cup on a small shelf she had cut into the curved wall. She hung her cooking pot from a wooden peg. She lit the lamp. She closed the door. She stood inside her house. The light from the lamp lay across the dark red wood of the walls and made them glow. The stove ticked softly. The air smelled of pine and smoke and clay. Outside, somewhere above her, the first flakes of snow had begun to fall. She put her palm flat against the curved wood of the wall. "Hello," she said quietly. She did not know who she was saying it to. The tree, perhaps. The man who had drawn this house 20 years ago. The man who had whispered 3 words at the end. The wind, the ground, the dead. All of them. She listened. Nothing answered, of course. Nothing needed to. She stood there for a long time. The snow that came down that Friday afternoon was not much. A light dusting. The kind of snow that makes the ridges look like they have been brushed with sugar. But it did not melt. It settled in. It thickened on Saturday morning, a heavier fall that came down slow and steady and silent. By Saturday night, the ground was white. By Sunday, it was 4 inches deep. On Monday, the temperature dropped 20 degrees and the wind began to blow out of the northwest. And by the time darkness came on Monday evening, the wind was screaming across the open ridge in a way Myron had never heard a wind scream before. The canvas over the trunk drummed. The stovepipe hummed. The whole world outside her door seemed to be moving sideways. Inside the chamber it was warm, not hot, never hot. Just a deep, steady warmth, the kind that fills a room slowly and stays there. Her small stove drank perhaps 4 logs a day, sometimes only 3. The thick walls of the trunk and the thick walls of the earth around the entryway berm held the heat the way a clay pot holds soup. The temperature inside her house never fell below 64 degrees, even when the wind outside was screaming. She knew this because she had a small thermometer that Otis Renfield had brought her on his second visit. A brass tube with a glass bulb at the end. And she watched it the way other women watch their children. It steadied at 64. Sometimes it climbed to 67 when the stove was working hard. It did not move. She had built a thing that worked. The Great Freeze, the country would call it later. The newspapers used that name first. And then the old men picked it up. And within a generation, the name was the only one anybody used. The Great Freeze of 1908. The winter that took 37 souls in this corner of Vermont alone. The winter that broke the back of 3 settlements and emptied a quarter of the small farms on the eastern slope. It started in the second week of December. The temperature, which had been bad enough at 20 below zero, dropped to 30 below, and stayed there for 9 days. Then it dropped to 40 below. The wind did not stop. The snow piled in drifts as high as the second story of a house. The cold did things that the people of the valley had not seen done before. Iron rang like glass when you struck it. Spit froze before it hit the ground. A horse left out for an hour grew a coat of white frost across its eyelashes that would not melt even in a barn. Wells froze solid. Springs froze. Streams that had run for 100 years stopped running and became long white scars across the land. In Pine Hollow, the houses began to fail. They had been built in the conventional way, the sensible way, the way the grandfathers had taught. Raised foundations, stone pilings, floors lifted clear of the ground. They had been built to keep the snow at bay and to let the air move beneath them. They had been built for ordinary winters. This was not an ordinary winter. The wind got under the floors. The wind got into the walls. The houses bled heat the way a wounded man bleeds blood. People stoked their stoves day and night. People burned their furniture. People burned the rails of their fences. People wrapped their children in every blanket they owned and sat together in single rooms while the rest of the house froze around them. A man named Carter, 2 miles east of Pine Hollow, was found dead in his own kitchen, with his coat still on, sitting upright in his chair, the fire in his stove cold for 6 hours. A family named Pelham, 4 children and a mother, were taken in by the Methodist parsonage when the roof of their farmhouse caved under the weight of the snow. The minister gave them his own bed and slept in the woodshed. And that was a kindness that was talked about for a long time afterward. The town had never known fear like this, not since the war. Silas Holbrook's farm was the finest in the valley. 2 stories of clapboard painted white, a wraparound porch, a parlor with red wallpaper, and a piano that his wife played. A brick chimney at each end of the house, 3 big stoves, a barn with 20 head of cattle, a smokehouse, an ice house, a chicken coop, a spring house over the cold water that had run in a fine year-round stream from beneath the hill since his grandfather had built the place in 1841. By the 4th day of the deep freeze, Silas's house was failing. The wind had peeled 6 shingles off the south slope of the roof. A fine dust of dry powder snow was sifting down through the attic and settling in the upstairs hallway. The pipe from the kitchen pump to the spring house had frozen solid on the 2nd day, and on the 3rd day it had burst, and a sheet of ice was now glazing the kitchen wall and creeping out across the kitchen floor. The cattle in the barn had stopped giving milk. 2 of them had died standing up in their stalls on the 5th night, frozen where they stood. The men he had hired for the winter 3 farmhands who lived in a bunkhouse behind the barn had walked out on the 2nd morning of the freeze and headed for the village. They had not come back. Silas and his wife Adelia were now living in the parlor. They had moved their bed downstairs. They had nailed quilts over the parlor doors to seal the room from the rest of the house. They were burning every stick of wood in the house, and they had begun to break up the chairs in the dining room for kindling. The 2 parlor stoves, which had been built for showing off and not for surviving, were running red hot day and night, and still the room was so cold that Adelia's breath came out in clouds when she spoke. Silas had not slept in 3 days. His face had gone gray. The confidence that had filled his cheeks for 45 years had drained out of him, and what was left was a thin, frightened man huddled in a quilted dressing gown beside a stove that was eating his furniture. On the morning of the 6th day, the spring house pipe burst at the source. The water that had run for 60 years out of the side of the hill stopped running. The pipes inside the spring house cracked. The reservoir froze. They had no water. They had 2 pails of melted snow on the parlor stove, and that was all. Adelia began to cry. She had not cried in front of him in 20 years of marriage. Her face was very small and very white, and the tears froze on her cheeks before they reached her chin. Silas stood at the parlor window and looked out at his fine white house and his fine white barn and his fine white world, and he understood slowly the way a stone understands water, that he was going to die in this room. He was going to die in this room with his wife. They were going to be found like the man Carter, sitting upright in their fine parlor with their coats on and the stove cold and their hands frozen together on the arm of the divan. Unless he walked. He thought of the widow on the upper ridge. He thought of her tent. He thought of her foolish hole in the ground. He pictured her body curled at the bottom of the crater, dead 3 weeks now, frozen into a shape that would not thaw until April. The thought gave him a sour pleasure even now. The mole woman. The fool. She had refused his $50, and now she was a corpse on her own land, and he, Silas Holbrook, was going to live to see the spring. But the chimney smoke. He had ridden past her property on the 3rd day of the freeze on his way back from a failed errand to find more firewood. He had glanced up the ridge from the road. He had seen through the white blur of the storm a thin, steady plume of smoke rising from the high ground, from the place where the dead pine lay. It had not been possible. He had not believed his eyes. He had told himself the smoke was a trick of the wind, a ribbon of blown snow, an illusion. He had ridden home and not spoken of it. But now, 6 days into the freeze, with his wife crying in the parlor, and his cattle dead and his pipes burst, and his furniture being fed into the stoves, he thought of the smoke again. If she was alive, if somehow, against everything that was sensible in the world, she was alive in that hole of hers, then there was warmth there. There was shelter. There was perhaps water. There was perhaps the chance to bring his wife to a place where she would not freeze to death in the next 12 hours. He would have to walk to her. He would have to walk 2 miles in a blizzard at 35 degrees below zero, on snowshoes he had not used in 15 years, through drifts that were chest-deep in places. He would have to ask the widow, the woman he had offered $50 for the throat of a valley, the woman he had ridden away from in contempt, the woman whose husband had died with debts. Silas could have paid, and chose not to for shelter. He almost did not go. He stood at the parlor window for another hour. The cold worked its way through his bones. Adelia's crying had stopped. She had gone quiet in the way that frightened him more than the crying. She was lying on the divan with her eyes open, looking at the ceiling, not moving, not speaking. He went. He bundled himself in everything he owned. 2 coats, 3 sweaters, 2 scarves wrapped around his face, the fur-trimmed hat, heavy gloves over woolen liners. He did not take the horse. The horse would not survive the trip. He took the snowshoes which had belonged to his father and were strung with rawhide that had cracked in the cold but would hold for 2 miles if he was careful. He told Adelia to keep the fire fed. He told her he would be back by nightfall. She did not answer him. He went out into the storm. The journey took him 5 hours. It was the journey of a man who had never in his life been required to do something difficult. He fell twice in the first quarter mile. The second fall knocked the wind out of him, and he lay in a drift for a long minute looking up into the spinning gray sky, and he came very close to deciding that the snow would be a kinder bed than the one he was walking toward. But Adelia's face was in his mind. The white face on the divan, the eyes looking at the ceiling. He got up. He went on. The wind was a physical thing. It was not weather. It was an attack. It came across the open fields and across the frozen river and up the long slope to the ridge, and it had teeth in it, and it found every gap in his clothing, and it bit him in every gap. By the time he reached the bottom of the long track that led up to the Holbrook upper parcel, his face was numb. His feet were numb. His hands inside the gloves were a kind of distant ache that he could no longer feel as belonging to him. He climbed the track. He almost missed the property. The 10 acres had become a single white field. The dead pine had become a long white ridge in the drifted snow, a humped shape that could have been a wall, or a hedge, or a buried fence line. The crater at its head had filled in and become a shallow white bowl. The tent over the trunk was buried completely. There was no door visible. There was nothing visible. He stood at the edge of the road and squinted into the snow and very nearly turned back. Then he saw it. A thin ribbon of dark rising straight up out of the white hump shape of the buried trunk. A ribbon that did not blow, did not break, did not waver. A ribbon of wood smoke. She was alive. He waded down the slope to where he thought the door must be. The snow was up to his chest in places. He found the dip in the drift where the entryway had been dug into the earth, and he half fell, half slid down into it. And the wind dropped away from him at once, because he was below the lip of the crater now in the sheltered pocket she had made. He could see the door. It was small. It was made of weathered planks. There was a thin line of yellow lamplight under it. He raised his frozen fist, and he hammered on the door. "Marin," he shouted. His voice was a croak, a small, cracked thing torn away by the wind. "Marin." He hammered again. He did not expect an answer. He was preparing himself in the small, frozen space behind his eyes for the work of breaking the door down and finding what lay inside. He was preparing himself to find her dead. He was preparing himself to drag his wife up here through 5 hours of blizzard, to lie down beside the corpse of his sister-in-law and die with her. The door opened. A wave of warm air rolled out over him. The smell of pine. The smell of wood smoke. The smell of stew. A smell that was so completely the smell of a home that it did not seem possible. It was a smell that came from a different country. A country that had nothing to do with the screaming white world behind him. And it hit his face like a hand. She was standing in the doorway. She wore a wool dress. She was not wrapped in blankets. She was not shivering. Her hair was pulled back. Her cheeks had color in them. She was holding a wooden spoon in her right hand. Behind her in the soft yellow lamplight, he could see the curved red glow of the wooden walls and the small iron stove and the bed of pine boughs in the corner and the kettle on the stove making a small white plume of steam. She looked at him. She did not speak. She did not smile. She did not invite him in. She stood in the doorway with the lamplight behind her, and she let him stand there and look. He stared. His mouth opened. His mind, frozen and slow, tried to make sense of what it was seeing. The woman he had offered $50 to was standing in a dry, warm room inside a tree, standing easy, standing the way a woman stands in her own kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday, while outside 2 miles away his fine white house was eating its own furniture, and his wife was lying open-eyed on a divan waiting to die. He could not keep his feet. He went down on his knees in the snow of the entryway. He did not mean to. His legs simply gave up. He knelt in front of her with the snow caking his beard and his eyebrows and the long fur fringe of his hat. And he opened his mouth and tried to speak, and the only word that came out was the only word he had left. How? She looked at him for another long moment. The lamplight caught the side of her face. Her expression did not change. It was not triumph he saw in her face. It was not pity. It was something else. Something steady, the look of a woman who had been waiting for this exact moment and had decided long before he arrived what she would do when it came. She stepped back from the doorway. She did not say a word. She simply held the door open. He crawled forward. He crawled across the threshold of her house on his hands and knees, like an animal. And she pulled the door shut behind him. And the wind that had been screaming for 6 days was suddenly gone. The silence was so complete that for a moment he thought he had gone deaf. There was only the small ticking of the stove, the small breath of the kettle, the crackle of the fire inside the stove. He sat on the floor where he had fallen. He pulled at the scarves around his face. The ice in them cracked. He could not get the gloves off. His fingers would not bend. She knelt in front of him without a word and unbuckled the gloves and pulled them off. She unwound the scarves. She unbuttoned the top buttons of the outer coat. She did all of this without speaking, the way a mother undresses a small wet child who has come in from the rain. Her hands were warm. He had not felt warm hands in 6 days. She helped him out of the heavy outer coat. She helped him out of the second coat. She left him in his sweaters. She poured a cup of hot water from the kettle and pressed it into his hands. She closed his fingers around it. She held them closed until he could grip the cup himself. She still had not spoken. He drank. The hot water hit the back of his throat, and a long shudder went through him. And the shudder did not stop for almost a minute. His whole body shook. The snow on his clothing began to melt and run in small, dark lines down to the floor. When the shaking had passed, he looked up at her. "Adelia," he said. His voice cracked. The pipes burst. "We have no water. The cattle are dead. She is on the divan. She is not crying anymore. I do not think she will live the night." Maren did not answer at once. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked to the stove. She lifted the lid of the iron pot that sat there. She gave whatever was inside it a slow stir with her wooden spoon. She replaced the lid. She turned back to him. "I will need an hour," she said. He blinked. She went past him to a small chest beside the bed of pine boughs. She knelt and opened it. She took out a folded wool blanket. She took out a small leather flask. She took out a pair of heavy woolen socks and a second pair of mittens. She put these things into a canvas sack. She closed the chest. She stood up. She crossed to where her own coat hung on a wooden peg. A long, heavy coat that had been Elias's taken in at the shoulders. She put it on. She wound a scarf around her face. She pulled on her own boots, which sat by the door. "You cannot," he said. "The wind, the cold. You will not make it." "I have made it before," she said. The first true words she had spoken to him since he had fallen across her threshold. Her voice was calm. It was not warm. It was not cold. It was simply level, the voice of a person who was making a plan. "I will go for Adelia," she said. "You will stay here. You will feed the stove. You will not open the door. You will not leave this house until I come back. Do you understand me, Silas?" He stared at her. Why, he said. Why what? Why are you going? She looked at him for a long second. Because she did not earn this, she said. She opened the door. A blast of frozen air rushed in. She did not flinch. She stepped over the threshold. She closed the door behind her, carefully sealing the gap. He heard the muffled crunch of her boots on the snow of the entryway. Then the wind took the sound, and there was nothing. He sat on the floor of her house, and he listened to the silence, and he understood that he had just been spared by a woman whose husband he had let die. She came back at midnight. She had Adelia in a sled, a wooden hand sled, the kind a child uses on a hill that Maren had pulled the whole way back. Adelia was wrapped in 3 blankets and had been alive when Maren reached her, barely sitting in the same position on the divan, with the parlor stove cold and the temperature in the room down to 12 below zero. Maren had dressed her in dry, warm wool from a closet upstairs. Maren had wrapped her. Maren had carried her to the sled. Maren had pulled her 2 miles through the blizzard in the dark in temperatures that would have killed a strong man in an hour. Silas met them at the doorway. He carried his wife inside. He laid her on the bed of pine boughs. Adelia opened her eyes, once looked around at the warm wooden walls, looked at her husband, looked at Maren, and shut her eyes again. Within an hour she was asleep, breathing slow and even, her color coming back. Maren did not collapse. She did not weep. She unwound her scarf. She poured herself a cup of hot water. She drank it standing up. She unlaced her boots. She set them by the stove. She crossed to the small chest and brought out a second blanket and laid it over Adelia. Then she sat down on the small bench she had built into the wall opposite where Silas crouched on the floor beside his sleeping wife. She looked at him for a long, quiet minute. Now, she said, "We are going to talk." The conversation that followed lasted almost the rest of the night. Silas wept first. He had not wept since he was a boy, he said. He could not stop. He sat on the floor of her house with his face in his hands, and he wept for an hour. The thing he wept for was not at first anything he could put into words. He wept the way a wall weeps when a hairline crack opens at the base of it, and the water that has been held back for 15 years begins to come through. When he could speak, he spoke. He told her about the panic of '93. He told her about the bank in Bellows Falls. He told her about the day he had walked into the loan officer's room with a clean copy of his father's signature in his pocket, a signature he had practiced on a piece of brown paper for 2 hours that morning at his kitchen table. He told her about the $3,000. He told her about the 300 he had walked out with. He told her about the small voice that had spoken to him on the road home that day. The voice of his own father, asking him what he had just done. He told her about how he had silenced that voice. He told her about how the silencing had become permanent year by year, until he no longer remembered that the voice had ever spoken at all. He told her about his father's last week, about how Bertram had asked him to come to the bedside and how Silas had refused 3 times, until the last day when his father was already too far gone to speak. He told her about how he had stood at the foot of the bed and looked at the dying man and felt nothing or nothing he was willing to feel, and how he had left the house an hour before Bertram died because the death was taking too long and the cattle needed feeding. He told her about his brother. He told her, and this was the part that came hardest, with long pauses with his face turned toward the wall. Elias had known. Elias had known about the forgery for almost 10 years, since their father had told him in his last week. Elias had said nothing. Elias had lived in the same valley, a quiet man in a rented room, and had nodded politely to Silas at the church on Sunday mornings, and had said nothing. Elias had carried it. Elias had eaten the secret the way their father had eaten it, the two of them, the quiet ones. It had killed their father. It had been killing Elias too slowly, the way a thing in the lung kills a man slowly, except that what was in Elias's lung was not only consumption, it was also the thing he had not been able to say. In August of last year, Elias had finally come to Silas. It had been a Sunday afternoon. Silas had been on the porch. Elias had walked up the long drive in his good black coat, thinner than he had been in the spring, and he had stood at the foot of the porch steps, and he had told Silas quietly that he was dying. The doctor had said a year, maybe less. He had asked Silas for a loan, $80. A specialist in Boston had a new treatment, a course of injections that some said arrested the disease for 5 years. 6. There were men walking in Boston who had taken the treatment and who were still alive after a decade. The treatment cost $80. Elias did not have $80. He had asked his brother. Silas had said no. He had not even pretended to consider it. He had stood on the porch and he had looked down at his thin brother in the worn black coat, and he had said no. He had told Elias that a man should not borrow against another man's pocket. He had told Elias that a man should learn to live within his means. He had told Elias to go home to his wife and prepare her. He had told Elias that he, Silas, would do what he could for Marin when the time came. He had not given his brother $80. He had $8,000 in the Bellows Falls Bank. He told Marin this. He told her with his face still turned toward the wall, and he told her in a flat voice that had no tears left in it. He told her that the $80 would have paid for the treatment. The treatment would not have cured Elias. Nothing would have cured Elias. But the men who took it lived for years, sometimes many years. Elias might have had 3 more years, 5. He might have lived to see this winter from his own warm parlor with Marin beside him. He told her that he had said no because he was afraid. He had been afraid that if he gave his brother $80, his brother might live long enough to speak, long enough to tell, long enough to walk into a courthouse in Brattleboro and make a sworn statement about a forgery in 1893. He had let his brother die rather than risk being told on. He turned his face from the wall. He looked at her. "I killed him," he said. The words came out flat. There was no drama in them. He was reporting a thing. I did not put my hands on his throat. I did not pour poison in his cup. But I had $80 in my pocket, and he asked me for it, and I knew what would happen if I refused, and I refused. I killed him as surely as if I had cut him. Marin did not speak. She sat on the small bench and she looked at him across the warm, small room. The lamp burned on the shelf she had cut into the wall. The stove ticked. Adelia slept on the pine boughs. her breath slow and even, now her face beginning to flush with the color of a living woman. Maren did not weep. She had been weeping for 8 weeks on and off in private, in the long nights inside the canvas tent and then inside the chamber. She had wept for Elias and for the children they had not had, and for the 11 years that had passed too quickly. She had wept for the house in Pine Hollow, with the pale rectangles on the floor where the rugs had been. She had wept for her own hands. She had wept herself empty. There were no tears left in her for this. There was only the steady, cold thing in her chest. The iron thing. The thing that had clicked into place on the afternoon Silas had ridden away on his fine wagon and left her with $50 she had refused. She looked at him. She thought about what she could do. She had known since Otis Renfield had told her the story by the crater that she had power over this man. She had not yet known how much. She knew now. She had the journal. She had the sketches in the tin box. She had the letter from Bertram. She had Otis Renfield, who would swear in any courtroom in the state to what Bertram had told him. She had a separately registered deed for the upper parcel that Silas had not even known existed. She had almost certainly a stronger position than that, a position whose full shape she would not understand for another 4 months. When the spring came and she dug up the second tin box, she could ruin him. She could send him to the state penitentiary in Windsor for forgery. She could bankrupt him in civil court. She could take his farm and his cattle and his fine white house and his red wallpapered parlor and the piano that his wife played, and she could leave him with nothing, and the law would back her at every step. She could do all of this. She thought about Elias on his last night, the eyes that had looked at her with that strange sorrow, the 3 words, the pine, the pine, the pine. She thought about Bertram, the careful handwriting, the drawings sealed in oilcloth, the letter that said, "Make my brother answer for what he did." She thought about what answering meant. She looked at Silas. He was still on the floor beside his sleeping wife. His face was wet. His shoulders were shaking very slightly. He was, she realized, waiting to be told what was going to happen to him. He had set himself down on the floor of her house, and he had handed her the knife. She stood up. She walked across the small room. She knelt beside the chest. She opened it. She took out the leather journal. She took out the tin box with its drawings and its letter. She took out a single folded paper from a place at the bottom of the chest, a paper she had been keeping there since Otis Renfield's second visit, on which she and Otis had together written down in his shaky hand, and then in her clear one every detail he could remember of what Bertram had told him. A sworn deposition witnessed by no one yet but Reddy. She set all of these things on the small wooden table she had built into the wall. She turned to Silas. "I want you to look at these," she said. He raised his head. He looked at the papers on the table. He looked at the journal, the letter. He understood slowly what he was looking at. He understood that he had not been spared because she did not have the means to ruin him. He had been spared because she had decided not to use them. She sat back down on the bench. She folded her hands in her lap. "Here is what is going to happen," she said. She spoke for a long time. She spoke quietly. She did not raise her voice once. He was going to confess, not to her, to the valley. He was going to walk into the Sunday service at the white clapboard church on the hill the next Sunday after the freeze had broken and the roads had cleared. And he was going to stand up in front of the congregation, and he was going to tell them what he had told her tonight. Every word of it. The forgery in '93. The $300. The day he had let his brother walk away without the 80. He was going to make it known in writing to the bank in Bellows Falls and to the county clerk in Brattleboro that the lower parcel sold in 1893 had been sold under a forged signature, and he was going to make whatever financial restoration the law would accept, paid out of his own pocket into a trust that would be administered by Otis Renfield for the benefit of the Holbrook estate, which meant for the benefit of Maren herself. He was going to take half of everything he owned, half of the $8,000 in the Bellows Falls Bank, half of the cattle, half of the woodlots, half of the rental income from the 3 farms he had bought up in the last 6 months. And he was going to put that half into a fund. The fund would be used for one thing. It would be used to build houses. Houses for widows, for families burned out by fire, for sharecroppers and tenants and people the bank had foreclosed on. Houses built the way she had built this one. Houses partnered with the land and the dead trees the foolish loggers had left behind. Houses that would stand through winters like this one and not fail. He was going to learn how. He was going to come up here in the spring every spring for as many years as he had left to him. And he was going to learn from her. He was going to put his hands on the tools. He was going to do the work himself. He was going to know what it cost in a man's shoulders to make a house out of a fallen tree. That was what answering meant. She finished speaking. She did not threaten him. She did not have to. The journal was on the table. The letter was on the table. The deposition was on the table. He understood what would happen if he refused. But also, she said, and this was the last thing she said before she stopped speaking and let the long silence of the room come back. Also, you will not be hated. You will not be shunned. You will not be driven out of this valley. After you have done these things, after you have stood in the church and said the words and signed the papers and put in the years, you will come up here on a Sunday afternoon and you will sit at my stove and we will drink coffee. Because we are family, and because you are doing what your brother died asking you to do, and because the dead deserve to know that the living have come to terms. Silas looked at her. His face did not change. His shoulders had stopped shaking. He looked at her as though he were seeing her for the first time. A widow, a young woman, his brother's wife, a person. He did not speak. He nodded once slowly. It was enough. The freeze broke on the second day after Christmas. The snow began to settle. The wind dropped. The temperature climbed back above 0, then up into the teens, then into the 20s. And the country began to count. It's dead. 37 souls in this corner of Vermont alone. The number would be in the newspapers for a month. Old men would speak of the great freeze for the rest of their lives, and they would teach their grandchildren to fear an early dense pressure in November, the way a sailor fears the green light at the rim of a clear horizon. Adelia walked out of Maren's house on the morning of the 3rd day on her own 2 feet, leaning lightly on her husband's arm. She thanked Marin. She did not have words for what had been done for her. She did not try to find them. She held Marin's hand for a long minute at the doorway. She wept quietly. She walked away with Silas down the long track, and the smoke from Marin's chimney rose thin and steady behind them. Silas did what he had been told. He stood in the church on the second Sunday of January. He spoke for 19 minutes. He did not weep this time. He stood with his hat in his hand, and he told the congregation what he had told Marin every word, and the church was silent the whole time. And when he was finished, he sat down beside his wife, and the minister rose and said the things that ministers say when something true has happened in a church, and there is nothing more to add. The papers were signed. The bank was notified. The fund was established. Otis Renfield administered it with a careful hand for the next 4 years until his death, at which point Marin took over the administration herself and ran it for 30 more years. The story of the upper parcel went around the valley in the way such stories go. Within a year, Marin had visitors. By the second year, she had students, other widows, tenant farmers, a young couple who had been burned out of their farmhouse by a kerosene fire, a family who had come up from the lower mill country with nothing. They came to her and she taught them. She taught them how to read the land, how to find a fallen tree of the right size, how to use controlled fire and patient labor to hollow out a chamber, how to dig and burn and partner the earth, how to build a chimney of clay and stone that would not burn the house down. The houses began to appear one by one on the marginal lots of the eastern slope. They were called pine houses. Some called them ground houses. They were not handsome by the standards of the valley. They were low. They were strange. They settled into the land and grew moss on their backs and bloomed with wildflowers along their berms in the spring. They did not look like houses. They looked like features of the land that had decided to give shelter. But they did not freeze, and they did not fail. And the people who lived in them were not very often the people who had laughed at Marin in the early days. The people who lived in them were the poor, the widowed, the forgotten, the ones the valley had been ready to bury under the next great freeze and would not now be able to. In the spring of 1909, the snow melted off Marin's 10 acres at last. She came out one warm morning in late April with her shovel and her adze, and she began to extend the kitchen garden behind the trunk of the dead pine. She dug down into the soft earth near the back of the root ball. About 2 feet down, she struck metal. She knelt. She brushed away the dirt. It was a second tin box, larger than the first, wrapped in 2 layers of waxed canvas. Inside, when she opened it, she found the original deed. Bertram Holbrook's hand clear and shaking only a little. The date was March the 14th, 1893. It was the deed for the lower parcel. The deed Silas had not actually possessed when he had walked into the bank. The deed Bertram had hidden in this box on the very week of the forgery, knowing what his son had done. Knowing that the forged copy would never quite be the original. Knowing that one day someone might dig in this place and find the truth. Beneath the deed lay a small leather pouch, 12 gold coins, $80 in eagles, double eagles, and half eagles. The savings of an old man, buried with the truth. Marin did not need the deed anymore. She did not need the gold. She had what she had built. She had the fund. She had Silas, who came up the track every Sunday now and sat at her stove and drank coffee with her. She had Adelia, who had become of all things a friend. She kept the deed in the chest beside the journal. She buried the gold coins one by one at the base of saplings she planted along the eastern edge of her property. White pines, her own. The years went on. She did not remarry. She had not been built for it after Elias. She lived in the chamber inside the trunk for the next 47 years. The trunk grew over with moss. The berm grew over with wildflowers. From the road, the house looked like a green hillock, a sleeping creature. Children who walked past on their way to school would stop and wave at it, even when she was not at the window on the chance she was inside. Otis Renfield died in 1912. He left her his store. She sold it back to the town and put the money in the fund. Silas died in 1927 of a heart attack in his own bed with Adelia beside him. He had spent the last 18 years of his life building houses with widows. His hands at the end were as calloused as Marin's. He died, by all accounts, a man who had finished what he came to do. Adelia outlived him by 20 years. She died in Marin's chamber on the bed of pine boughs in 1947, holding Marin's hand. She had asked near the end to be there. Marin had not refused her. Marin herself lived to be 79. She died in the autumn of 1958, 50 years to the month after she had walked up the long track from Pine Hollow with 17 cents in her pocket. She died in the chamber inside the trunk in the bed of pine boughs, and the house she died in was warm. A young widow named Theodora Greaves took the place over. Theodora had come up the track that summer with her infant daughter and a borrowed wagon looking to learn the work. Marin had been teaching her for 3 months. On the morning Marin did not come out, Theodora found her in the bed with the lamp still burning and the leather journal of Elias Holbrook open on the small table beside her. The last entry in the journal had been written by Marin herself, sometime in the last week of her life. The handwriting had grown shaky again, the way Bertram's had grown shaky at the end. It said only this: "The land does not belong to the richest man in the valley. It belongs to whoever loves it most. Hand this book on. Tell the next one what we did here. Tell her she will not be erased." Theodora read it. She closed the book. She held it for a long time. Then she walked to the small shelf cut into the wall, and she set the book there carefully, where it had always been kept beside the brass thermometer that still read 64 degrees. Outside, the first thin dusting of an early snow had begun to fall on the back of the dead pine. 50 years a house, and the smoke from the chimney rose thin and steady against the gray autumn sky, the way it had always risen, the way it would rise for another 20 winters, yet until the woman with the new infant on her hip had grown old herself, and the house had passed to the next pair of hands, and the story had become what stories become when they have been told well enough for long enough, a thing the country had stopped being able to forget.